Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of the Prove Me Wrong podcast. Tonight, we're going to dive into a topic that, to be honest, I didn't even know existed before maybe 6 months ago. We're going to talk tonight about the life and specifically the death of the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. Was his death the result of an accidental overdose in his bathroom, which honestly is the story that I had always known, or was it something more nefarious than that? Was Elvis actually murdered? My guest tonight is author and researcher Stephen Ubaney, and he is going to present the case to support the position that Elvis did not die by accident, but that in fact he was murdered and his murderer was never brought to justice. Stephen merged his love of history and his quest for the truth, and he became the architect of the Who Murdered book series. Since the inception of the series, numerous volumes have been published, and as he works towards a completion of a 5-volume set, which is scheduled for completion somewhere in 2022. His research has made him a frequent guest on television, radio, and podcast programs worldwide due to his in-depth knowledge of the material. His books currently include Who Murdered Elvis, Who Murdered FDR, and recently published Who Murdered Diana. He also has 2 more projects in process that will be released soon. You can find more on Steve's books on whomurderedbooks.com and amazon.com. Welcome, Steve, to the show.
Hey, Pete, thanks for having me.
So, if you would, start me off with the history as to when and why you started this research and why you decided to write these books.
You know, I get asked that a lot, and I really don't have a great answer. I think you have to be inspired.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you have to gravitate to what you love. So I write about things that interest me. And I always, you go through middle school and high school and college and things, and you have to write down, in history class, you have to write down the answer that they want. And of course, right. A lot of the answers I just didn't believe. You know, in the FDR case, I found it hard to believe that FDR, Mussolini, and Hitler all died within 18 days of each other.
Wow.
I thought it was a little bit suspicious. I thought it was suspicious that FDR died, quote unquote, of natural causes at the same time Allied troops were storming his bunker. So anyway, here we have, here we have a lot of history that I just never agreed with. So I decided to dig into the things that I had always earmarked that I didn't believe. Who Murdered Diana actually is being published here in about 2 months.
Oh, okay.
So it's not quite out yet. I'm having some difficulty with the British government, as you could well imagine.
Oh, sure.
Having problems getting some interviews with some people. So as far as Elvis Presley's concerned, I've been a Presley fan. So my mother started me being an Elvis fan. I mean, she's been in love with this guy since she was 11. I think she saw him on the Dorsey Brothers show, which is his first television show. So by the time I was 10 or 12, I think I knew more about Elvis Presley than most people did, And when he died, I'm old enough to remember where I was and what we were doing. I never bought it. I always knew there was more to the story. I never believed it. I thought it was an Easter Bunny story. I like to call these things Easter Bunny stories. I never believed it. And I always knew that one day I would look into it. And, that day came about 10 years ago. And the more I started to dig, the more I started to realize that we've really been lied to. Elvis Presley got between the mob and the FBI, and he was in grave danger. And I think this was the cover story that they put out because we're not good with the truth, and I don't think in 1977 especially, we're still struggling with the truth in 2020. In 1977, we wouldn't have been able to handle what really happened. And I think now that, when you investigate something, everyone's looking for answers, and all the answers are tightly held to the vest. But when people stop looking, decades and decades later, the truth starts to leak out. By that time, no one's looking anymore,
right?
Except people like me. So I was able to go back in, reinvestigate these deaths in this book series, piece together the snippets of information, and really solve what happened with newly found information. So that was that's where the inspiration for this book series came from.
And did you always have a series in mind, or was it just initially you had this interest in Elvis and you wanted to research that? Did you have that long view from the start?
No, I did not. I started out with the first Elvis book, and I put that out, and I stumbled across the FDR book, and then I did the 5th anniversary edition of the Elvis Presley book, which has even more information in it.
Oh, okay.
And it just, it just blossomed from there. It was one thing after the next, and I didn't start with the series in mind. It was kind of funny how it happened.
Well, you probably don't have any shortage of books. You could probably do a 30 book series. I mean, honestly, of mysterious and slightly, Marilyn Monroe. She died under mysterious circumstances. There are a lot of people that you could probably write and put into these books. As you know, I have a copy of the book and I have read it. And if you don't mind, I can, kind of go through the first section of your book. Outlines the birth of Elvis as an entertainer, how he was discovered, kind of at the beginning of his popularity. I was very young when he passed. I was 4 years old when he passed. So I had nothing more than really a casual understanding of his work. Can you start us off with some of his early history, kind of the beginning of your book, talk about how he rose to fame and then some of the challenges that came along with it?
Well, Elvis was born in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a shotgun shack, basically, very, very poor. And he had a stillborn brother, Jesse, and he was actually the second one born. And he got his musical influence from going to the Baptist church, and they used to sing in church, and he's picked up we're dealing with a rhythm and blues gospel mixture, which is what he made into his own style. So that's the beginnings of him. When he was very small, his father was, it's kind of funny, his father ended up in jail for a time. He ended up, and this actually affected him a great deal. This is how he ended up being so close with his mother. His father went to jail for a time because he was raising a pig to slaughter, him and his two cousins. And he was selling it to, he was a farmer, worked for a farmer, and he was selling it to that farmer who was also his landlord. And they said he was going to give him $14 for it. Well, that was a king's ransom when you're poor and you have a little baby to feed. They ended up giving him $4 for it. So he was so mad, he took the check, a $4 check, and they forged it to make it a $14 check, and all three of them went to jail. So Elvis Presley ended up being very close with his mother because it was just his formative years. It was just the two of them. The father was out of the picture. So they finally got, when they were all united as a family, it was quite a bond, between Elvis and his mother. He had a very good relationship with his parents. So growing up was very difficult for Elvis. He was an only child. The family actually ran out of work in Tupelo. They went to Memphis. And by that time, you're dealing with the 1940s, and there was public assistance, and that's where he lived. He lived in public housing in Lauderdale Courts in Memphis. And that's where he met the majority of the people who would go on to be his Memphis Mafia, his group of friends that he took with him. They came up through school. They were his boyhood friends and so forth. But Elvis had a tough time. It was a crew cut thing in where he was going in high school. Everyone was wearing crew cuts, and here he comes with this flamboyant dress and the James Dean haircut, and it was tough on him. He definitely was an outcast.
So was he always? So he was always on that musical path. It wasn't something that kind of hit him in a eureka moment. It was something that he lived that as early on as grade school.
Yeah, he was crafting his new musical style for years. He was really good friends with B.B. King. He was good friends with a lot of the black performers who at that time were not getting on record. So he would go to he was too young to get into bars. What he used to do is he used to hang outside, and he used to listen to them and watch them play through the window. And every now and then he'd find a sympathetic bar owner who would let him come in and watch. And he was learning the whole time. So his mixture was, his music was a mixture of country, gospel, and rhythm and blues. And he mixed all of that together and made his own style, which is really kind of interesting. But what an impact this guy had on society. He came along. The reason why Elvis Presley is so baked in the cake of Americana, he rose to fame. It was the first time kids had their own music. Portable record players came out. Television came out with Elvis Presley in 1955, 1966, when Elvis made his rocket ride to fame. He was baked in the cake with all of it. He rode it right to fame, because before that, kids were listening to whatever their parents were listening to. They were listening to Glenn Miller and whatnot. So for the first time, kids had their own identifiable music. And, you know, that opened the door, actually, to, there were no black artists getting on record. So there would have been no Motown. There would have been no Michael Jackson. There would have been nothing like that. So Elvis really pierced the veil. Someone had to be first, and it was him.
And it is really impressive. And I did remember, I did think that early on, most bands or artists, they don't, I mean, they change over the course of their career. You know, sometimes the music, you know, the natural evolution to the music. But I didn't know many people who, to me, went to such extremes. You know, because like you said, he had gospel records. He had rock and roll, quote unquote, rock and roll records. He had things that could have been considered rhythm and blues records. You don't see, you know, you didn't really see most bands doing that. They got tracked into a certain style of music, and that's where they stayed. They may have evolved slightly over time, but he was so varied and was accepted really in all of those genres, and that to me is also very unique. It didn't seem to happen much.
I can't recall who said it, but it was 7 different styles that he was singing in, from gospel to rhythm and blues to country to, you know, I mean, and I can't remember where the quote came from when I stumbled across it, but it was 7 different genres and styles that he was singing in. So it was a really interesting thing. But, you know, when you grow up in the 1950s and you have churches burning your records and, you know, smashing your records and this and that because they think they can't accept it. It's quote unquote the devil's music. You know, this is one of the reasons why Colonel Parker went to such great lengths to keep Elvis crystal clean. They had to keep it going, you know.
So what age was he when he broke through? I mean, how old was he when he really started to gain some traction and started to experience some fame?
Well, in 1954 and 1955, he was on the Louisiana Hayride, which was regional. I mean, he was a regional star. He was handled by Sam Phillips under Sun Records in Memphis, but he wasn't getting the exposure that he needed. So his manager at the time was having some money problems. So Colonel Parker comes along and sees this act and knows he's the next big thing. Now, Colonel Parker, he was already a veteran of the music world. He was managing Minnie Pearl, Hank Snow, Gene Austin, Roy Acuff, June Carter Cash, which was Johnny Cash's wife.
Right.
And the big one was Eddie Arnold. He exclusively handled Eddie Arnold. So he gets a hold of Elvis, and Elvis's mother hated Colonel Parker, hated him on sight. So it was quite a con job to get her on board with it. So he bought the contract from Sam Phillips at Sun Records, and it took him national. So the rocket ride Elvis had, I think he was 19 or 20, 1956.
So he had no choice then in being connected with Colonel Parker. Colonel Parker bought his contract, and that was it. He was his manager. Pretty
much, yeah. Eddie Arnold had warned Elvis and Vernon not to have anything to do with Colonel Parker. They were both warned, but you know, you're dealing with a time when, you know, he was making a little bit of money, but he wasn't anywhere near wealthy at that time. So you know, when you put your hand in your pocket and you feel nothing but your leg, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to ignore somebody who's offering you millions of dollars and all kinds of future. So. And that's what happened, and that's the two of them. The Parker Presley 1-2 punch lasted for a while, quite longer than it should have, actually.
So his fame takes off, and he rockets. And it becomes a problem, right? I mean, it definitely becomes a problem where, especially with the advent of television and really the emergence of television and the way Elvis moved, the sexuality that he exuded, the perception or the real impact that had on the youth of America. You even posed, if I read it correctly in the book, that the war effort and him being drafted was almost a byproduct of his popularity.
Absolutely. And, everyone who he was in the middle of filming a movie.
Uh-huh.
And all of a sudden, he gets drafted in the Army, and he was causing such a stir, causing such a problem for the federal authorities. They had to draft him to get him out of their hair.
Wow.
In the hopes that this thing would calm down. They did the exact same thing, carbon copy, to Cassius Clay. They had to draft him to get him out of the way because of the Black Panther movement and everything, the black militants he was attached to through Malcolm X. So that happened before anybody did anything. Elvis Presley did everything. So it started with Elvis. They drafted him to get him out of the way, hoping everything would calm down. They did the same thing with Muhammad Ali later on. So
they were just trying to take a couple of years out of his career, allow the furor of Elvis to die down. They weren't necessarily trying to put him in a position where he might be injured. It was more just to take him out of the public eye.
Yeah, let everything settle down. Maybe let him grow up a little bit. Let him calm down a little bit. Let everything just settle.
Mm-hmm.
And, they had enough recordings in the can, so to speak, that they could continue to release records while he was gone. So it was almost like he was never gone, because they started releasing records, while he was over there in Germany. So they prepared well for it.
And you said he was in the middle of a movie at that time. He did a lot of movies, right? I mean, how many movies did he end up?
I think it was 31.
31 movies.
I believe it was 31. And there was a time when they were doing a movie start to finish in 30 days.
Wow.
And that's when it got to the point where Colonel was working this guy into oblivion. He started getting running bloody noses that wouldn't stop. And the doctor came in and they said, look, this guy's resistance is shot. You've got to give this guy a couple of days off. I mean, it became golden handcuffs. And, he was doing these horrible movies. Well, they were not all horrible, but eventually they ended up that way.
Mm-hmm.
And, he ended up then this is where I ended up being friends with Susanna Lee, who was his co-star in Paradise Hawaiian Style. I ended up being friends with a lot of his friends, actually. And she said that the first 4 scenes that she shot weren't even with Elvis. He had people who were stand-ins for him, who were actually surgically altered to look like him. So Elvis was laying down the music tracks in the studio, and she was doing these shots with other people who looked similar to Elvis, so they could keep that 30-day schedule, and he could be in 2 places at one time. Oh, actually, wow. There's a very famous photograph of Susanna Lee with her arms around Elvis for Paradise Hawaiian Style. And if you look real close, that's not Elvis. Elvis's face is very triangular. This guy's face is very U-shaped. That's one of the lookalikes. And this is why you're having these Elvis is alive people out there, because they're seeing these people. They're seeing the lookalikes. So they're, they have...
Yeah, not to jump too far ahead, but yeah, that's pretty much exactly where my brain went when you say things like that. Is what better way to disappear than to, you have people who are surgically altered, they look just like you. Yeah. One of them passes away and you pass away, and now you have a get out of jail free card.
Right.
But I don't want to get that far ahead just yet. So, how did he become involved in the mob? I mean, was it just through Colonel Parker that he became involved in the mob? Did he even understand how in deep he was with the mob?
He understood exactly how deep he was.
Okay.
And this all started from Colonel Parker. Colonel Parker, his name wasn't Parker, and he wasn't a colonel. Okay. He was a stowaway from the Netherlands He was born in the Netherlands, and his real name was Adrius Van Koo, and he was born in the Netherlands of a big family. And he was fascinated with the circus when he was a teenager, so he ran away and joined the circus, and this is where he learned how to be a pitchman. He started out tending for animals and this and that, and he worked his way up through the circus ranks, so he ended up being a showman and a circus promoter, which is how he learned the tricks of the trade that would carry him into the musical, to handling large music acts in America. So this is what he was doing, gaining money to come to America, working on the shipping docks part-time, and of course working in the circus when they were around. So on May 17th, 1929, there was a murder over there. A woman named Anna van den Eden was murdered. And that is when Colonel Adrius Van Koo disappeared in the Netherlands, and this person appeared in America, came in, went into the army, went AWOL, and took the name of his commanding officer, Colonel Tom Parker. So this is how this person came about. And, we didn't have the records or the technology or anything like we do today. So this person could just wander the streets of America. He got a dishonorable discharge. He went AWOL, and they put him in solitary confinement, and he actually emerged with a mental illness. They said he was a psychopath. So here we have this person wandering the streets of America, already a murderer, taking on huge talents in Las Vegas. And this is how he became so baked in the cake in Vegas. And I had to tell you that story to tell you this story. This is where the mob comes from. Okay. Mm-hmm. You don't play Vegas in that era, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, unless you're hand in hand with the mob. All right. Because they ran everything in Vegas. If you saw the movie Casino, although parts of it were fictitious, you kind of get the idea of the stranglehold they had.
Right.
On Vegas. So Colonel Parker was very steeped in the mob. And the same people who tried to run Elvis were also running Frank Sinatra's career. And the first person that Colonel Parker befriended with was a person from the Detroit Syndicate who bought the Bingo Club in 1947, which later became the Sahara. And he also owned the Aladdin and the Mint. His name was Milton Prell. And he was a huge player in Las Vegas. You don't play Vegas unless you're friends with Milton Prell. The second big boy out there was a guy named Mo Dallas. There was no one bigger in the 50s and 60s. He was from the Cleveland Syndicate, and much like Milton Prell, they were out there laundering money. The Cleveland Syndicate came from, they used to run liquor, and they had to launder the money into something. So they went on being, buying the Stardust and the Desert Inn. But his real job, Mo Dallas' real job out there was to be a real close friend to Meyer Lansky and Jimmy Hoffa. So those are the people who already ran Frank Sinatra's career.
Right.
Tried very hard to get into Elvis, and they came real close. Colonel Parker and Mo Dallas actually became neighbors in Palm Springs later on down the road. So here we have, let me fast forward to Elvis's wedding. Okay. Frank Sinatra's playing, and the whole thing was done in Milton Prell's hotel, the Aladdin. The guy couldn't even plan his own wedding.
Wow.
He was up to his chin in the mob, and he couldn't get out. So it started out 75-25 split. Colonel Parker took 25%, Elvis got 75%. And then it went to a 50-50 split. And towards the end, it was still a 50-50 split on the books, but Colonel Parker was doing side jobs, side promotions that Elvis was not getting a part of. So towards the end, it was more like an 80-20 split.
What was the event that caused it to become a 50-50? Why did Elvis agree to that?
He didn't have much of a choice to agree to it. He was starting to rebel against the colonel.
Uh-huh.
And the colonel held an impromptu meeting and basically said, he threw some people out of his inner circle because he didn't like the way it was going. One of those people was Larry Geller was Elvis's hairdresser, and he was getting Elvis involved into these spiritual things and reading books and this and that. And Colonel Parker didn't like it because Larry Geller was smart enough to tell Elvis to get away from Colonel Parker. So he got thrown out. A couple other people got thrown out of Elvis's inner circle. And the colonel said, okay, we've got this, and this coming up, and you're going to do this. Or if you don't do this, you're not going to do anything else. So he wasn't going to, he was reading a movie script. And and I know the guy who was in the room, and I'm not going to mention his name because he told me not to. But
okay.
He's reading a movie script. It's a movie script. And Elvis flips out, throws the script all over the room, and says, it's the same script. Last movie, I was a race car driver. This one, I'm a motorcycle rider. The next one, I was driving speedboats. It's the exact same script. And he said, I'm not doing it anymore. That's it. So the next day, he doesn't go down to report to film. Colonel Parker came up. The studio came up. RCA came up, all their representatives, and they basically said right there, you're going to do this or you're not going to do anything else. And the great debate in the room was, after they left, were they threatening his career or his life?
Right, exactly.
So Colonel Parker said right then, now it's at 50-50. I'm doing all this extra work from you. It's going to be a 50-50 split, and I'm going to backdate it from the beginning of the year. Well, hell, it was August then. So he got a 50-50 split. And Elvis was powerless. What could he do? The guy had the full force of the mob behind him.
You know, quite honestly, the most fascinating part of the book, almost in my mind, was the Tom Parker, was the revelations about him, his past, you know, the kind of person he was, because I had no idea about him. Quite honestly, I didn't know anything about him. So, so that whole story that you just recounted about his past and the potential murder and kind of coming in, changing his name and just being someone else and having the ability to operate in the United States free from repercussion. That just amazing to me. Was there ever a point where, I mean, was he actually a suspect in the murder? And, you know, why wasn't there ever any effort to extradite him back or hold him accountable?
Oh boy, how long is this? We got an hour, a little over an hour.
Yeah.
Well, they couldn't extradite him back because, well, let me think here. How do I do this and not give away the book? We'll just say that people were much more naive in 1977, and you were not finding his records because his friendship with Milton Prell made those records disappear.
Okay.
So there was no backtracking to this. So
he essentially said, I'm Tom Parker, and nobody could prove he wasn't. There was no paper trail that proved he wasn't.
And that was the reason why he did the 1973 Aloha from Hawaii concert, which was satellite all over the world, because he was getting multi-million-dollar invitations to perform at the pyramids at Giza in Egypt and all over the world. And Elvis really wanted to do it. And Colonel Parker never told him why he couldn't do it, but that's why. He couldn't get a passport. Couldn't get out of this country. And he's not going to go anywhere without Elvis. So they did this to satisfy the fans around the world. They did this Aloha from Hawaii. So you have the mob all the way around Elvis starting to squeeze in. Okay. At the same time, Elvis is starting to get threatened. He's started in 1969. Elvis was starting into fear from his life. There was one, I don't know how credible this is, there was one account that Elvis was kidnapped for a couple days and was held for ransom. I've never been able to prove that. That came from one person, and I won't give her name. Right. But in 1969, things started getting a little bit hairy. So Elvis he starts to realize he's already a black belt. He's already carrying guns on him all over the place. He stood at Sonny West's wedding as best man with 5 guns on him. You know, he was really hunkering down for some stuff. I think the bars on Graceland are gone now, but bars appeared on Graceland for a reason. And, you know, I mean, they were all in fear of their life. If you look at Graceland and you look at Michael Corleone's compound in Godfather 2, right? Find me a difference. You can't.
Yeah,
You have gates, you have walls, you have guards, you have closed circuit cameras, you have everything. And this is exactly what Greystone became, a compound.
yeah, that was really when I became kind of aware. That was the Elvis that I was aware of, was the gun-toting, cape-wearing, very, I don't know, not necessarily militant, but much more armed Elvis. And it just seemed like, without knowing the backstory of it, it just seemed, does he gone a little kooky? I mean, what is with this recent fascination with being armed and physical protection? But that was the Elvis that was the first one I got. I never got the young, I was not born, right? I was too young. So all I ever saw was the older Elvis at that point, where he was, overweight or much heavier than he had been previously. And again, carrying guns everywhere, doing karate moves everywhere on stage or what have you, and kind of seemed almost like a parody of himself. But you're saying that he has that level of pressure on him at all times, and that fear of his life that would drive you to do some not necessarily some not irrational things, but some take steps to take care of yourself. I can get it.
Yeah, I think that we all evolve,
Right.
the course of our lives. And I think that product came from a lot of evolution over the years of a lot of things that people didn't know about. And this, his band of brothers around him were so incredible and so tight. Nothing got out from Elvis and nothing got into Elvis. And this is why we have this insatiable thirst for anything that's Elvis, because things are coming out now we haven't known. It's been 43 years. A guy died 2 days ago, 43 years ago. And things are still coming out. I mean, I couldn't find evidence like this when I was 12 when he died. I couldn't do it. It just wasn't out there. It takes decades for people to come forward. And once they come forward and you start to piece these snippets together, then you can start to realize, oh, this is why this happened. So there's a lot of digging in that book, I'll tell you.
Do you feel that is partially because of the people that were involved, and maybe needing to have those people pass away, or their influence is no longer there, that allows other people to loosen up and come forward, like you said?
Sure, I think so.
Yeah.
So here we have Elvis for 1970-ish, and he starts to realize he's starting to get threatened, to the point where he's got a .45 strapped on his ankle when he's on stage, which is hid by his bell bottoms.
Right.
I mean, it's getting to the point where he needs to legally carry a gun in every state. So he goes to see Richard Nixon December 21st, 1970, to get federal credentials of any kind to be able to carry these guns wherever he flies in every state, so he can be protected. So things got so crazy, and that was his first way to get traction against the mob influence and how they were trying to take over his career. He was starting to become, he was a federal narcotics agent. He started to work with the FBI and bringing people down and so forth like that. So he was doing that so he could carry guns in all the states and start to get a little bit of traction against the mob influences around him. So from the outside looking in, these probably look like crazy things, but we didn't know the other side of the story.
Right. So he, per the book, he was very close to, he had a lot of information on individuals, and he was about to be called to testify prior to his death. That's correct?
Right. Part of what happened, well, let me get to the progression of that.
Sure.
Okay. Aloha from Hawaii comes and goes, smashing success. I'll give you an example of what happened here with this guy. So Aloha from Hawaii happens. He's on tour. He's in Vegas for 2 months a year. That's his contract. And what Richard Nixon asked him to do through those 2 months is take FBI agents and put them in his band and pose them as band members so they can investigate the mob. Okay. So it got so thick around him. February 18th, 1973, right after Aloha from Hawaii, Elvis is on stage, and four guys rush the stage. And Elvis doesn't see him at first. He's off to the side, you know, giving kisses and doing whatever he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
And 4 guys come up and try and take Elvis out. 3 of them get taken out by Elvis's bodyguards, who were behind the curtain in the stage. The 4th guy gets to Elvis. Elvis, who's a black belt, foot sweeps him. The guy falls back into the crowd, and he on the mic, he says, "I'll kill the next son of a bitch that comes on this stage." Well, they got so scared, the backup singers, the Sweet Inspirations got so scared, they wouldn't come back out. They were done for the day. That's it. They were gone.
Right.
Because what they knew was what nobody else in the crowd knew. Elvis has got a gun strapped to his leg on stage. This could have gotten really scary. So you have all of this going on, him with federal narcotics agents, him being threatened, him housing FBI agents as band members, and you have his manager in the mob. This is not going to end very well. Okay, so I'd love to take credit for all this information, but I can't. There was an Elvis. There were 30 years of information before I got into it.
Mm-hmm.
I just finished it, and that information about the band members being posed, or FBI agents being posed as band members, came to everyone from Maria Columbus in 1990. She was going through Graceland. She's an Elvis investigator.
Yeah.
And she was going through Graceland, and she found a document in Elvis's trophy room from the federal government thanking Elvis for his cooperation in some operation. Well, she got a hold of the federal government and wanted to know what this was about. The federal government was the one who told her that Elvis was posing FBI agents as band members in his band. So this came right from the government.
And so that was the first time that they had ever mentioned that? They just happened to find somebody on that day that Dan picked up the phone and didn't realize they weren't supposed to talk about it?
To my knowledge, yeah.
That was just the first time Elvis has been working with us.
Yeah, this is the first time. I mean, we don't ever know what they're doing, but
right.
This one was a little interesting. So all of this is leading up to this tragic ending of Elvis Presley's murder. You can't have Colonel Parker. You can't have Colonel Parker and the mob with all of this mob pull, trying to control everything from the movies, and and he was probably one of the most degenerate gamblers that ever lived. When Elvis died, Colonel Parker was in debt to the mob $32 million at the gambling tables.
Wow.
Now Elvis is on stage knocking him dead, doing 2 to 3 shows a night, 7 days a week, which no one does. It was entertainment servitude is what it was. And he's well paid. He's making $125,000 a week. Elvis was the first actor in Hollywood to ever make $1 million a picture. So he was well paid, but he was also well abused. It was entertainment servitude. This was a velvet jail. So Elvis hated playing Vegas after a while. Colonel Parker loved it because he was doing his favorite thing. He was gambling on Elvis's dime. So this is not going to end well. You can't have Colonel Parker owing that, at a time when average families are making $6,000 a year.
Right.
Parker's gambling away $1 million a night on Elvis's dime. So you have the mob element, you have the federal element, you have threats coming into Elvis, and this is not going to end well. Actually, January 27th, 1972, the Washington Post came out with an article that said that Elvis Presley got federal narcotics credentials from Richard Nixon. They posted the thing in the newspaper, in the Washington Post. It's in my book.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first time that anybody had a little hint of what was going on. Later on, when Maria Columbus came out with that response to that letter, we realized the depth of where we were. So Elvis dies mysteriously shortly before he's supposed to turn state's evidence against the mob in their Las Vegas investigation. But there's something else going on that is putting Elvis on the opposite side of the mob. He had he had a plane he was selling, the Hound Dog 2,
Mm-hmm.
and he owed almost $900,000 on this thing. It was dry docked. Elvis had bought a bigger plane because that's what everybody was doing. You know, Led Zeppelin and Elvis Presley were two of the biggest acts in the world. At one time, they were both handled by the same people, and he wanted a plane to equal or rival what they had. So the older plane, the smaller plane had to go. So his father puts this thing up for sale. Who tries to buy this plane is a mob figure named Frederick Peter Pro, who has been doing, the FBI has been watching this guy for a decade. He's doing an international smuggling ring. He calls Vernon, wants to buy the plane, but he says the plane is not up to current standards. So he says, look, I got a deal for you. You'll be able to make more money. You can bring it up to standards, and I'll pay you monthly. He said, how do I do that? He said, you borrow money, you bring it up to the standards, I'll take the plane, and I'll give you back payments. Well, Vernon, who was barely literate, borrowed extra money, the plane disappeared, no payments came. So they're after Frederick Peter Pro under what's called codename Operation Fountain Pen. And so now Elvis has crossed the mob twice. One for the operation in Vegas, the other one for the disappearance of his plane. All of this is going on behind the scenes, and no one knows about it. The public doesn't know about it. The last time we ever see Elvis Presley, he's got a jumpsuit on from the DEA, I believe. If you look at the jumpsuit that he's wearing, that he's got a DEA jumpsuit on, a sweatsuit, because he was playing racquetball, allegedly.
Right.
So all of this is leading up to 1977, and it got to the point where the faces of Vegas had changed. New people were running the casinos. They were not going to let Colonel Parker, they're not going to wait on his $32 million anymore. Parker started to become threatened for his life. And he started to realize that Elvis had some medical issues. And he was starting to cancel some dates. Got to the point where Elvis became more money dead than alive. So 1974 comes around. Elvis's manager, Parker, starts to realize his image never tires. I can sell posters, I can sell poker chips, I can put his face all over everything. Because he's starting to cancel dates. You know, if Elvis dies, I'm still making money. It doesn't matter if I have a live Elvis. So he was actually, they started Boxcar Enterprises, which Elvis had a little chunk of, but like most of the deals that Colonel Parker put before Elvis, it was grossly unfair to Elvis. He was actually Elvis Presley Enterprises before Elvis Presley Enterprises was Elvis Presley Enterprises. Okay, it was this Boxcar Enterprises was the first attempt to commercialize Elvis Presley's image, his signature on everything. So what Colonel Parker was doing was positioning himself for the time when Elvis was no longer around to keep the cash cow going.
How was Elvis not in control of his own image? I mean, how does that work, legally? You know what I mean? Where I get that this is his manager, but how is he not in charge of? Didn't he have to give his sign off in some way for that kind of marketing?
They did that because they gave him. He did sign off. There was a lot of things that Colonel Parker did that were not fair to Elvis. For example, there's a couple examples. 1973, Elvis is in financial trouble. Priscilla had reopened the divorce in another state. This time she came back for a gigantic sum of money, and she took half of his publishing rights. Elvis is hurting. He's in a cash crunch. This is right after Aloha from Hawaii. 1973 was a terrible year for Elvis Presley. And his manager comes up and says, I've got an idea how you can get some money quick. Well, Colonel Parker's real client was RCA, wasn't Elvis. There was no fiduciary responsibility to Elvis here at all. So he says, look, you sell the rights to all of your music to RCA. That'll give you the money to get out of the hot water with Priscilla, and the world will turn. So he did it. RCA got a fortune. Colonel Parker got a fortune. Elvis got virtually nothing. So he was tricked into selling all of the royalties for all of his music, Hound Dog and Blue Suede Shoes and all of that for nothing. In 1976, Elvis Presley was the highest, he paid the highest tax in the state of Tennessee. He was the biggest taxpayer in the state of Tennessee. He had no tax shelters. So I've said it before, I'll say it again, it was entertainment servitude.
Wow.
So that was one of the things. After Elvis dies in 1980, there's a big wrestling match that comes about. Priscilla has now got Graceland. They're trying to get his image taken away from Colonel Parker. There's a big lawsuit. And Blanchard Toole was one of the, Tual, was one of the attorneys who looked into the case. And his famous statement, which is going to escape me, basically said that many of the deals that Colonel Parker did with Elvis he had no fiduciary responsibility to Elvis at all. It was almost like he was working against Elvis.
Wow.
And because you have Vernon, who's these were honest guys. They were nice guys. They weren't stupid, but they could be tricked by someone who was good at tricking people. And Colonel Parker was good at tricking people. So Elvis dies 1977, August 16th, 1977. There's $1 million in the bank. That's it.
Wow.
Now, the Recording Industry Artists of America have Elvis selling 6 billion records with a B. That's all they can track, because when he started his career, they weren't able to track all these records. And so he probably sold more than 6 billion records. That's just what they can track. Where the hell's all the money? I think, and I haven't been able to prove it, I haven't been able to prove this, I think there was a long-standing blackmail somewhere. And I think the mob bled him dry. And I have not been able to prove that, but the money had to have gone somewhere. I mean, now you realize he was generous. He used to give away Cadillacs and houses and this and that. If he made $1 off those 6 billion records, he'd have $6 billion.
Right.
Where the hell's all the money? Something doesn't add up. So all of that comes to the death. And of course, theories abound, right?
Yeah. So then the second part of your book does kind of go into the discovery of the body and the inconsistencies in the crime scene and the testimonies, right? So can you take us through that as well? Actually, hold on just a moment on that thought. I'm going to take this opportunity right here just to go ahead and say that we're going to have to do this in 2 parts. And this is going to be the end of part 1 of our discussion with Mr. Steve Ubaney regarding the murder, potentially, of Mr. Elvis Presley. Please be sure to tune in next week. We're going to have a whole nother hour of information. We're going to continue on with Steve and talk about the suspects, the evidence, and ultimately lay out the case again for why Elvis Presley's death was not an accidental overdose, but in reality was a murder. So before we go then tonight, I'm going to go ahead and say our program has been brought to you tonight by Java Remix. Java Remix is the perfect blend of 100% organic Arabica coffee infused with nano-emulsified CBD. You can start your day off on the right foot with a great tasting cup of coffee with all the demonstrated benefits of pure CBD. Java Remix offers traditional ground coffee, as well as single-serve K-Cups in both regular and decaf. And if you aren't a coffee person, Java Remix also offers CBD-infused teas and even beauty products like bath bombs and body scrubs. As an added benefit for our Prove Me Wrong listeners, if you go online right now, javaremix.com, and enter the promo code Prove Me Wrong, you'll receive 20% discount off of your entire shopping experience. Java Remix also offers free shipping on all orders over $40, so you literally have no reason not to give it a try. Once again, that's javaremix.com, promo code Prove Me Wrong. The Prove Me Wrong podcast is brought to you tonight as well by ZendoZones citronella burners from JT Eaton. They are shaped like fearless bug-repellent tiki gods. So go ahead and let Surfin' Stan, Hawaiian Howie, and Luau Lily bring the islands to your backyard with ZendoZones citronella burners. ZendoZones uses natural 3% citronella candles and incense cones, perfect for patios, decks, backyards, campsites, poolside, and more. You can enjoy the outdoors again. You can find them now on Amazon.com or at select Ace Hardware stores, so go ahead and collect them all today. So once again, from my guest tonight, Mr. Steve Ubaney, we're talking about who potentially murdered Elvis Presley. This is the end of part 1. Come back next week and tune in again, and we will continue this discussion through to its conclusion. Once again, for the Prove Me Wrong podcast, my name is Pete Lieb, and I will talk to you again soon.